So when Jay told me, hey, we're going to interview Richard Burgess, he gave me the time and the date, and I said, oh, man, I can't do it. I said, you have to do it, but can I at least do the intro? And he said, well, sure, go ahead. So here I am doing the intro. Of course, Richard Burgess, he's an English musician, singer, songwriter, record producer, composer, author, manager, marketer, and inventor. And of course, he is the president and CEO of A2IM. That's the American Association of Independent Music. A wonderful chap. And I'm so bummed I didn't get to actually be there for the interview. But at least now you get to hear Jay's interview. And I also get to say, let's let it roll.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand!
Your morning coffee is on the air. 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 On the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Richard, thank you so much for joining us today. It's so good to see you again.
So good to see you too, Jay. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Let's talk about you're going to be stepping down from being the president and CEO of A2IM for 10 years. This is going to happen at the beginning of next year. Talk a little bit about A2IM, and so much has changed in the last 10 years. It's mind-blowing.
It is mind-blowing. Yeah, it's been an interesting time. I mean, I started in 2016 here. I've been a member actually since the beginning, since 2005. I wasn't a founder member, but we were there right in that first year. And it was just a great organization. I wound up on the board, and I wound up chair of the board. And then when Rich stepped down, my predecessor, there was a whole search process. And in the end, they asked me to do it. I wasn't actually applying for the job, but they asked me to do it. And it's such a great organization, I thought I had to do it. So, and it turned out that was kind of an interesting moment to come into this job, because it happened to be that was when streaming really started to kind of take off in a big way. And so it was definitely been an exciting time. And then we had the, 2.5, 3 years of the pandemic, which was a whole other thing. And yeah, I mean, and now we're hitting the AI period. But I decided to step down because I'd been at the Smithsonian for 14 years before this. And prior to that, I always worked for myself, my own companies or whatever. And I just had sort of made a rule that I wouldn't stay more than 10 years. And I have other things I really want to do that I'm excited about. Got to get on with it. And I also feel like somebody else could probably take it now, and it's like a relay race, right? They'll do amazing things with it in the next 10 years. So it seems like a perfect time for me.
Well, I'm excited to learn about your next chapter. Let's talk about your earlier life, because you have an amazing background coming from the world of music, as a musician, as a producer. I mean, so many different lives that you've lived. Talk a little bit about your background and your inspiration. What really drew you into the world of music and production?
So I got fascinated. I mean, we were not a musical family. There was nobody in my immediate family that was a musician. My uncle played piano by ear, but that was it really. And but we were sort of a radio family. My grandparents listened to the radio. My parents listened to the radio. It was just on all the time. And back in those days, radio was, it was AM radio. Everything was on the radio. So, you would hear all kinds of things, and you were exposed to all kinds of music. I mean, example I was given the 60s, and I'm talking about the 50s, but in the 60s, you'd hear Frank Sinatra next to Jimi Hendrix, and that's sort of unimaginable these days, but and for the past 37, 40 years even, but that's how it was. And it was kind of, it was great in a lot of ways. You heard a lot of stuff you didn't like, but you were exposed to an awful lot of different things. And the thing that actually drew me in, I didn't know this at the time, but I realized later as I started to learn about music, was the blues, really. And what I kept hearing was blue notes in the music. It was in the pop music, not just in hardcore blues. But once I figured that out, what blues was, and that really pulled me in. And I'm not just talking about blues as in, the 12 bar blues and everything, although I was infatuated with that for a time. But, the blues and everything, soul music, even country music has it, and even bluegrass has it, and it's called bluegrass. But those blue notes and the dominant seventh chords and things like that, and that really pulled me in. So eventually, I figured out that what I really liked was sort of American music, and then I realized that was kind of African American music, really. And then I realized it came from Africa and through New Orleans, and you figure it out as you go along, basically. But that just totally sucked me in, and actually. The reason I went to the Smithsonian, funnily enough, was because when I was about 12 or 13, I used to go to this record store in Christchurch, New Zealand, where I grew up. And one day I went in and they handed me this record and said, "You got to listen to this. I know you'll like this." And I put it on, and it turned out to be Leadbelly. And I didn't know about Leadbelly, but there was a British artist called Lonnie Donegan who covered all his songs, like professional things. So I knew every single song, and I knew the minute I put that record on that this was the source. This was, Lonnie Donegan was great, but Leadbelly was unbelievable.
Yeah, and the Beatles were really influenced by Lonnie Donegan.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, George Harrison said, "No Leadbelly, no Beatles." It's quite fantastic. So when I got offered the job at Smithsonian, I really wasn't even thinking about taking the job because I always liked working for myself. But I thought I got to go work with that catalog. And they have a lot of other great stuff too, like Sonny Terry and Brown and McGee, and then they have Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and Pygmies, and God knows, it's a fascinating catalog that. So that kind of generally sucked me in. And then of course Motown came along, and Stax came along, and then funk and soul like Sly and the Family Stone and the Commodores, P-Funk, and also jazz. I also got sucked into jazz, Miles Davis, and those kinds of things. I remember spending about 9 months trying to figure out Bitches Brew, which is just one of the challenging records. I mean, as a teenager, it was incredibly challenging. And when I finally figured it out, it was like just an amazing revelation. So those are the kinds of things that sort of got me excited. And all I really ever wanted to be was a drummer, a studio drummer, actually, funnily enough.
Wow. That is incredible. And what great comfort food to grow up on, those artists. And they still stand up today. Talk a little bit about, I mean, we could talk for hours about your career, Richard, but there's got to be a few highlights, some projects, some moments that stand out, that were sort of defining for you throughout your career.
Well, I mean, I think, there's a lot of ways to look at defining moments, but there are sort of breakthrough moments. The thing about, I've got a few books out, and I always talk about this. You always need a certain amount of luck in every career. You work hard. I always like that saying, the harder I work, the luckier I get. But the truth of the matter is, some people do work really hard and they just don't get lucky. And, I've had a couple of really lucky breaks in my life. And one of them was I got offered a gig in the top band in New Zealand it was called the Quincy Conserve. And they had like a 6-night-a-week residency at the biggest club in Wellington, New Zealand. And they were the house band for HMV Records, which was EMI, basically. There's a studio in Wellington. At the time, there weren't a lot of studios in New Zealand. There wasn't a lot of opportunity to record. It's not like today where everybody with a laptop can record something. And, it was high tech and it was expensive and so on. So that was like the most amazing opportunity for me. And I was very young. I think I was 21 anyway. And I took that gig and, just working 6 nights a week, 4 hours, 5 hours a night. I can't remember. It was long, long nights, but I just loved it. And then working in the day in the studio too. So sometimes, 16-hour days. But amazing stuff. And we played on practically every record that came out in the year I did that gig. But my goal was always to break out and go either to the US or the UK. So I went back to the UK, which is where I was born, and sort of managed to rekindle or, get into the studio scene there, which is what I wanted. Again, my ambition was relatively limited, but I was just so excited about playing in studios and recording and everything. That's what I wanted to do. And I did that for several years, but I was always playing in bands and doing pickup tours and writing songs and things like that. And that's what came to me being an artist. And then I suppose the biggest kind of break or landmark project for me was joining the band Landscape, which was not super well known in this country, but we had some pretty big hits in Europe and the rest of the world. One in particular called Einstein a Go-Go, and one that was on heavy rotation on MTV right when MTV first started up, and it was called Norman Bates. My name is Norman Bates. I'm just a normal guy. And what was amazing about that band was everybody was really smart. Everybody was really great musicians. It was like a sort of I don't know how you put it. It was kind of like a competition between the five of us, just and not in a bad way, but it was like someone would write something and you go, holy crap, I want to write something as good as that. And so you go and you write something else. And all five of us were writers. It was really, really an amazing experience. First off, they were incredible musicians to play with. We toured all the time, very often playing 5, 6 nights a week. And I think at one point I did something close to 300 dates a year. And I was still doing studio work. I just loved to play. And then that led me into producing. So the next big break I got really was when the Blitz Club started up, and somebody who I taught to play drums, Rusty Egan, he was the DJ there, and he called me and said, "You got to come down to the club." I went down to the club. It was this amazing scene, nothing like I'd ever seen before. It was like it was like the sort of the bar scene in Star Wars, and 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 I realized that the music we were making in Landscape really fit in there, and then through that, I got offered the production gig with Spandau Ballet. And I hadn't really produced anything commercially before. I'd produced tons of demos and I'd been in studio. I'd also, owned my own recording equipment for a very long time. Because I also had a sort of a technology background coming out of school. So that was a huge break for me because we finished the first single, to cut a long story short. And I believe it entered the charts 10 days later. I mean, it was that quick. And the record went gold, I don't know, in 3 or 4 months, something like that. It was amazing. I mean, I couldn't have had a luckier break than that. And from there, I was inundated with offers. The problem was everybody comes to you and then they offer you, they want to do Spandau Ballet Part 2, and I never want to do Part 2 anything. I always want to do, I'm not interested in sequels. I'm like, no, 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 let's do something. Let's do you, not somebody else. I'm not big on that.
And throughout your career, I'm sure you faced adversity. What are some of those moments that you remember where it was challenging that you overcame some kind of adversity?
I think, honestly, I've been pretty lucky in my career. And in retrospect, I look back and it's been relatively smooth. And what's amazing to me is how I've been able to be sort of transition from one phase of my career to the next, go from being a touring musician to a studio musician to recording artist to producer to manager to working at Smithsonian and then to here. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable. I find it unbelievable. But at the time, there was anxieties, of course. But I think the hardest thing to get past when you're a musician, when you're any kind of creative person, doesn't matter if you're an artist, a photographer, whatever, is rejection. You get a lot of rejection. And a lot of musicians I think in order to be a musician, you have to be kind of a sensitive, you have to be an empath in a lot of ways. And it hurts, there's no question. It takes you down and you have to be able to rise above that. You have to be confident enough in yourself that you can reject the rejection, as it were, but also, I think, emotionally intelligent enough to accept the rejection and try to understand what the rejection means and see if there's some sort of nugget of helpfulness in that rejection. What can I learn from this? What can I do better next time? And so that to me is probably the most difficult thing. But I find that actually that's stood me in good stead my whole life. I mean, like when I get turned down for things now, things don't work out quite the way I thought they would. It's nothing because I've been through that hundreds of times now. A lot of practice.
I bet. I bet you get asked a lot for advice. What are some of the things that younger, maybe developing artists, middle class artists, younger managers, people who are coming up in the business now, what do they tend to pick your brain about?
They pick my brain about stuff that I don't think they should be picking my brain about a lot of times. And how do I break in? And how do I do this? And the thing or my advice to people is understand as much as you can about the industry and how the industry works, and then figure out how you can make it work for you. And then you have to realize that unless you want it to be a hobby, you are a business. Even if it's just you, you're a business. You're a small and medium-sized enterprise that we're a small business entity. One person, sole proprietor. And I think, and there are some people who maybe are never going to be able to make a living at music. There's a lot of famous examples of that. Charles Ives, the famous sort of avant-garde classical composer in the mid-20th century, he was making music that at the time was extremely unusual. And he realized he was probably never going to make a living from music. So he became an insurance salesman. And he made a very, very good living as an insurance salesman, but he wrote some of the definitive 20th century avant-garde classical music. So, I mean, I think there is another way to go other than simply making a living at it. But for me, I always wanted to make a living at it. And I think most people do. And the truth of the matter is it's really different today than it was when I was starting out. But if you can understand the fundamentals and see where the gain is, where the potential gain is, then, you can figure it out. And I think, I know yeah, business has a bad reputation sometimes for ripping people off. But that's why you have to get to know about it. That's why I learned about it. I didn't know anything about the music industry when I started. I knew nobody, I knew nothing about contracts. But pretty quickly, you see that first contract and you read it. And even if you can't afford to get a legal advice, you start to be able to figure out, what's right and what's wrong and what's good for you and what's not going to be good for you.
Yeah, when I think of your career, it reminds me a little bit of people like Jack Holtzman in the sense that you embraced technology. You weren't afraid of it. And you were one of those early people when it comes to different types of technology throughout your career. Talk about things like synthesizers and drum machines and samples and now AI and what's your approach to new technology?
Well, it's interesting. When I was leaving school, they did a vocational guidance test, and they came back to me with this really puzzled look on their face. They said, "We don't know what to tell you." They say, "You test equally as being sort of science, technology based and artistic, creative." And then about 5, 6 years later, I was sitting in EMI Studios, H&B Studios in Wellington, and behind, at the time, what was a gigantic console with these gigantic speakers and all this technology around me. And I was thinking, I'm in exactly the right place. This is like creativity wrapped up with technology or technology wrapped up in creativity, whichever way you look at it. So I don't know. I've just always been fascinated by that. I mean, I bought a reel-to-reel tape recorder when I was 15, and that was just fascinating to me, being able to record things and play them back. So I've always kind of wanted to embrace technology. So synthesizers were fascinating to me. As you probably know, I invented electronic drums, which came about because drums were still, as I put it, in the Stone Age. I mean, they're basically a skin stretched over a hollow log still, and everybody else was playing these electronic devices. And I thought, well, that's not fair. I want one of those. So that's how that came about. But basically I was excited by the new sound palette at the time in the mid-70s. Records sounded a lot alike. You'd have a Fender Rhodes, a Fender bass, a Fender guitar, maybe a Gibson guitar, drums, vocals, and that was it. And maybe Hammond organ. And so when synthesizers came out, suddenly they were like, it was life-changing to me, sonically speaking. And I heard that immediately. And then, of course, when samplers came along, I recorded the first digital sample with Kate Bush. I actually flew out to Australia to meet the inventors of the Fairlight because I was so intrigued by it. And I'd been sort of tracking the development of computer technology through, there was a magazine called Computer Music News at the time, I think it was. And I was also talking to people at Stanford and URCAM in Paris about it because they had these experimental labs where they were using the big IBM machines to do incredible things with digital technology before digital really happened. And so I feel the same way about AI. And by the way, the same things that were said about AI were being said about synthesizers, and there's definitely with samplers, how it was going to destroy the industry. Same thing with computers. I mean, we made the first record, Landscape made the first record by computer, and everyone, people were saying this, this is terrible. It's, going to destroy industry. Computer can't have a feel. And I said, well, I'm a studio musician. I play on all these disco records, and we play with a click track. And computer doesn't need a click track; it's its own click track, And I knew from playing in the studios that the more in time you were, the better the groove sounded. So I wasn't concerned about computers not having a groove, and we would think that's laughable today. And I think 10, 15, 20 years from now, we'll think that a lot of the things that have been said about AI will be, kind of laughable as well. I do think there are dangers with technology, of course, and no one wants to see people lose their jobs or lose their, means of earning a living by any means. But the evidence is that when new technologies come along, that we adapt, and that it actually winds up making society ultimately better. The trick is you have to not fight it. You have to go with it, and you have to learn about it and adapt to it.
I think that's really important. I mean, weren't people pretty upset about Les Paul sort of electrifying the guitar? Or, I mean, hasn't this been sort of a recurring theme throughout the music industry that new technologies come and people say it's the end of the world?
They were upset about the piano. They thought the piano was a terrible thing. And the sax, I mean, Adolf sax, they thought it was a gross abomination. So yeah, I mean, it's Les Paul definitely. I mean, the electric guitar, people, hated it, and so it just goes to show, right? And think about how distorted guitar came around. I was just at Sun Studios in Memphis not long ago, and they actually have the amplifier there that Ike Turner played that had a broken speaker, and Sam Phillips was smart enough to say, no, it's fine, let's use it like that. And it was the first example of a distorted guitar sound on record, which is and it was actually on Rocket 88, which is the first, considered to be the first rock and roll record. So it's interesting that definitive sort of concept of distortion on guitars and rock and roll was right there from the very first record. So, yeah, I mean, there's always going to be naysayers. I think, you have to kind of, you have to stay above that, and you have to try to see the good in whatever the new technology is, and try to imagine how you can utilize that to be creative.
Absolutely, and it becomes a tool that musicians use. I was listening to the new Randy Travis record, and he can't sing anymore. He sadly suffered a stroke, but they used AI to train on his voice, and now he's got a couple of new singles out. And I just think that's absolutely stunning. So I think we're going to see people use this technology in ways we haven't even thought of yet.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, what I've said to people is AI is not really the threat. It's the business models we attach to AI that are the threat. So, and that's one of the things we work on at A2IM. We work with all the other trade associations, and, we're trying to make sure that there's a fair, reasonable, and not obstructive licensing regimen that goes along with AI. And it's unreasonable that this can't be figured out. I'm sure we can figure this out so that the AI companies can do what they need to do in order to make AI as powerful as they can possibly be, and so that creative people, journalists, photographers, everybody else can be compensated in a fair way as well. And I think we will. I mean, there's been some interesting court cases that have generally fallen on the side of copyright holders and creators. So I'm remaining optimistic about it.
Talk a little bit about your legacy and the impact of your career. How do you hope to be remembered by the music industry specifically about the impact that you've had and what you've left behind?
It's interesting. I don't really think about legacy at all because, I mean, frankly, I'd be surprised if anybody remembers me at all. But the one thing I do think is I'd like to, yeah, and that's part of the reason why I went to Smithsonian. Well, it actually was a major part of the reason why I went to Smithsonian as well, because I thought, well, maybe I can do something in terms of legacy for music in general. And then it's definitely a reason why I came here to HYM, because my real concern is for the next generations of musicians. And we've seen, some damage to the musician's ability to make a living over the past 25 years. There have been some positives with the digital disruption. There's definitely been democratization of access. It's very easy for people to make a recording. I mean, unlike when I was a kid, you didn't have to get a record deal and go into a big, really expensive studio and have a limited amount of time. You can do it on your laptop now, and it's available to most people of modest means even. But there are some negatives too. We're still, by adjusted dollars, we're still down 35-40% over where we were in 1999. And that means that, that money's not going to labels to support the artists, and it's not going to artists and musicians themselves either. So, I hope that we can get past that and wind up with, fair compensation for people's work. My rule has always been in my career, if someone's making money from my work, I should be getting a fair share of that. And, because I hear people say, well, musicians, nobody has a right to make a living. I go, well, of course, if you make a record in your bedroom on a Sunday night and nobody wants to listen to it, why should you get paid? There's no reason why you should get paid in that instance. But if you make a record on a Sunday night and suddenly millions of people are listening to it, then you should be fairly compensated, especially if other people are using that music to make a lot of money, or to make any money for that matter. You should get a fair share of whatever money is made. So, what I'm really concerned about is this kind of an homogenization of music. I think this is kind of what's happened with streaming, the sort of ubiquity of streaming, and it's kind of an homogenization. And streaming rewards repeated listens. And that's great for artists that make music that can be listened to over and over and over. But some of the greatest music that I've loved in my life and that I've appreciated and spent time listening to doesn't really warrant. You couldn't listen to it all day long. It's challenging music, but you can sit down and listen to it once every now and then. If you make a record like that today, you won't make any money from streaming at all. So I'm hopeful, and I'm seeing good signs that there will be new business models come down the pike that will reward those kinds of artists as well, the artists that make niche music, but that still deserve to be compensated fairly. Because if you're getting 0.3 of a penny, and you're, say, an avant-garde artist like a Ligeti or a Penderecki, or even, some of the like Cecil Taylor or someone like that, you're not going to make enough money to survive, and I'm concerned about that from a cultural perspective. We need to make sure that there's diversity of music available for all people of all tastes, and I hope that I can contribute to that in some way.
Before I let you go, Richard, what's going on at A2IM this year? Am I going to see you at Indie Week?
You'll definitely see me at Indie Week. I'll be a blur.
As always.
Yeah, no, I mean, I took this job and I thought this is going to be so great. I'm going to see every panel at Indie Week. I don't think I've seen a single panel in 10 years. The best I get is I get to look at the videos afterwards, but it's intense. But yeah, no, I'll definitely be in Indie Week. Lots going on. And we have the Libera Awards that's on the Monday night, the 9th of June. And we're excited about that. It's looking really, really good this year. It's at Gotham Hall. And yeah, I mean, we've been there. This is our second year there. And it's a really beautiful venue. So yeah, we've got a lot on our plate. We've got a lot of legislation rolling. We actually have a thing called the HITS Act, which is rolling out. I think the press release came out today, and we've been pushing this for several years. It needs to be attached to a tax bill, and there's one coming up that we are hopeful that it's going to be attached to, and it basically guarantees any costs incurred in making a recording can be claimed back from your taxes in the year that they're incurred. Currently, you have to sort of amortize them over 3 years. So, not to be too boring about it, but that, you know, if you're a small label or an artist making records yourself, or a publisher or a songwriter, this could be life-changing, because you get your money back for that recording that year, and you can go make another recording instead of having to wait several years to get that money back.
Keep up the great work. I can't wait to hear about your next chapter. And if I don't see you before, we'll see you at Indie Week. Thank you, Richard. Really appreciate your time.
I appreciate you too, Jay. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.